So good evening, everyone. Nice to be with you tonight. It'd be better in person, but virtually has a purpose. And what I'd like to do is run through a presentation quickly, sort of, because there's a lot to talk about when you talk about anything from other religions, world religions, and to see where we can get in. I'll probably go maybe as much as a half hour and then leave the rest of the time for discussion. But I came to this topic by thinking about how do we think about Lent and what is Lent really for? And not to presume that it's simply about giving up certain things and letting go of certain things for a few weeks and then back to normal. It's not merely about self-purification, but rather it has a role in the life of the church and a role, I think, in our life of our parish as well. I was taken up by the particular way I'm going to go with this by thinking about the gospel we heard in the first Sunday of Lent from Luke 4, where Jesus was driven by the Spirit out into the wilderness, tempted by the devil, eating nothing. At the end of those days, he was hungry. And that this was not simply for his own personal purification, but as it says, Jesus then returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit. And the news about him spread throughout the countryside. He was teaching in their synagogues and everybody praised him. And it seemed to me that the point of his being in the desert was to invigorate him and make him ready for mission. So that's a starting point. I put up here another picture just to get into the world religions theme right away. This is a fairly famous picture painted by a Christian artist for a Hindu group about the year 1900. Jesus in a yoga position. If you can read the print at the bottom, Jesus Christ in his yoga posture, quoting Mark's gospel, he was there in the wilderness and was with the wild beasts. And I think this, therefore, comes across as kind of a universal theme, that the retreat to the desert, stepping back, being outside the ordinary life, is something that people of different religious traditions have experienced and understood. And so that, I think, is a good starting point. The idea of withdrawing to solitude for the sake of mission is by no means only in this gospel passage that we have, or the alternative gospel passages. I list a few here on this page. Moses, remember, he kills a man and then he flees Egypt. He's out shepherding the flocks and meets God in the burning bush. And this is a 15th century portrayal of that event. In the background, he's taking his sandals off, and in the front, somehow God is speaking to him from the bush. But Elijah, the prophet, flees to Mount Horeb, the holy mountain, and meets God at the entrance of the cave in that beautiful scene where God is not in the storm or God in the loud voices, but in the still, quiet voice. And we know about John the Baptist in the desert. That certainly, we don't know how long that was, but it could have been years. Again, not for his own purification only, but rather to be the person who could then come out of the desert with a powerful voice and preach the coming of Christ. And what people often forget is that in his letter to the Galatians, Paul talks about his famous conversion on the road to Damascus. And then he's taken into Damascus, but he then goes up into Arabia and then comes back to Damascus. And it's 3 full years before he makes his way back to Jerusalem. And I think we'd have to take that as kind of his desert experience, his preparation moment, getting himself ready for what follows. So with this kind of starting point and these familiar scenes from the Bible, and you can think of others, I'm sure, to begin to think about what Lent is for and then how we can learn from other traditions. As an opening hypothesis here, I just say what you see on the screen. Among other things, Lent is a time in which we can step back, withdraw at least psychologically and spiritually, so as to return to ordinary life renewed for mission for our role in the world. So it's renewal, psychological, spiritual, even physical renewal, stepping back so that we can return. And like any good theme in the spiritual life and theological life, what can we learn on this from other religions? And any of you, and many of you do, have some familiarity with various other religious traditions. We could go on for hours and talk about parallels and differences from this tradition and that. But I limit my presentation the next 15 minutes or so to 3 figures: Gautama the Buddha, then Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, and then a less known figure that many will not have heard of, Andal, who was a female poet and saint in South India around the 9th century. And we'll see that the issue of gender comes up. What are men able to do in terms of renunciation, and what are women in the Indian context? So a Buddhist figure, a Muslim figure, and a Hindu figure are the three that I will bring forward before you. And be keeping any questions that you have or any comments, and then I'll be happy to talk as long as needed afterwards. So the first one is the Buddha. And I think everybody probably knows something of the story of the Buddha, this teacher from around the 6th century BCE, before the time of Christ. And there's a historical figure behind it. Gautama, everyone agrees, was an actual historical person. Many of the stories around him are woven together out of myth and history and his teachings and so on. And we can't be certain that everything said about the Buddha is true, but a consistent story is what you see here on the screen. Gautama, which is his name before he becomes the Buddha or the Enlightened One, confronted on the road a sick person, an old person, a dead person, and a person who had renounced the world. So you can see up in the upper left, that is the sick person. Below that is the old person. Then the bier being carried with the dead body on the upper right. And then he runs into a renunciant who's left the world behind. And the story is that he was destined to be either a great king, like his father before him, or to renounce the world. And to keep him away from renouncing the world, his father kind of kept him in a very secluded life in the palace, surrounded with every kind of pleasure, every kind of opportunity, and didn't want him to go outside. And he goes outside. He finally is curious about the outside world, and he goes out in his chariot, as you can see in all 4 pictures. And he encounters these, scenes that are highly symbolic. He sees a sick person, and he himself has never experienced ill health. And so he's puzzled by that. And then what happens if you get better from sickness? Well, you still get old, and your body begins to deteriorate. And then what happens there? You can't reverse that. You are then overwhelmed by death and you die. And what to do about this? Gautama, the stories go, was exceedingly shattered by this. He had thought life was perfect, that there'd be no suffering in life, but suddenly he sees that everything seems to be short and painful and futile. And so when he sees the holy man in the lower right, the story is that he realizes that his life in the palace has been something of a lie. He can't go back to that life anymore. And so he wants to find something else to do with his life. And after some dramatic scenes in the palace with his father and so on, he renounces the world and goes off into the forest. And he, by tradition, although he's often seen as a very healthy, kind of radiant figure on the middle path, when he goes out into the forest, he's trying to leave the world behind and conquer sickness, age, and death, and become a different kind of person. And there are these somewhat gruesome stories of his fasting, that he thought he will fast as much as possible to remove all worldly desires, all temptations from himself. And they say he's down to 1 bean and 1 grain of rice and 1 seed and 1 sip of water per day. And you can see this famous portrayal of him as an emaciated figure. And the stories go that after doing this for some time, he had the insight in his meditation, this is getting me nowhere. I've been doing this. I thought life in the world was impossible. Then I thought it was my body was the problem, but it's actually my state of mind. But to understand all of this, he spent, by tradition, about 6 years out in the forest. He had renounced the kingship and the palace and spent years out there meeting different teachers, trying to find his way. And finally, at the end of this period, and this is from the Buddha Charita of Ashwagosha, a text from, I think, around the 5th century, talking about how finally he realizes that he has a mission in life. So toward the end of his time in the forest, after he stopped this terrible fasting, he's tempted by the devil, Mara, M-A-R-A. And Mara tempts him and tries to get him distracted, sends him dancing girls to tempt him, offers him food, offers him riches, and he keeps rejecting these things. And finally, he breaks through. In the verses before this, he remembers his previous lives. He sees the world. He sees the beginning and the end of suffering. And then he decides he has to leave the forest and go back, remembering his former promise to help all beings, Gautama formed a resolution to preach tranquility. Thereon, he reflected in his mind how there are some persons with great passion and others with little passion. And I think he wants to teach people the path of dispassion, to learn to be detached in your life. Wishing to preach tranquility in order to dispel the darkness of ignorance, as the rising sun, the darkness dispels the darkness, Gautama went to the blessed city, the city of Varanasi, Kashi, Benares today, which was beloved of his friend Bhimarata, and whose various forests were made lush by the Varanasi river. So he goes back to the city that he had fled in great fear. He goes back. And then the sage, namely the Buddha, whose eye was like that of a bull, whose gait was like that of a running elephant, very strong, desired to go to Varanasi to convert the world. And the image, I think, is that of an elephant, a great figure turning around, turning his entire body around slowly like an elephant. He fixed his wide eyes on the Bodhi tree of his enlightenment and then goes back to the city. And I think much more could be said on this story. I'm going to introduce each of them very briefly. That he wouldn't have called it Lent, of course, but nonetheless, he couldn't go from being a prince in the palace to being a great wise man and preacher. He needed this sojourn in the forest. He needed to be out there, trial and error, too much fasting, too little fasting, being tempted by the devil to find his way back to become a great teacher. And then by tradition, after he returns to the world for the next 45 years, until he dies about age 80, he is a great preacher. But those 6 years were really his establishment in mission. And that's really where his story, I think, has something to teach us about looking at the world differently and needing to step back from it in order to understand what to do.
What new advice?
Oh, that was not for me, I guess. Okay. So the second figure that I put before you is the Prophet Muhammad. And I'm not an expert on Islam. And so if anyone has insights on this, I'd welcome them. But I was thinking about, other great figures in human history who had a profound effect. How did they become the people that they do? And so admittedly, I found online the account by al-Bukhari, who I believe was kind of an early Muslim teacher and historian. As you can see, I found on the web, made a compilation of the sayings and deeds of the Prophet Muhammad, who had lived maybe a couple of centuries before this time. Al-Bukhari is highly regarded by Sunnis as a reliable account. And he offers this account of the beginning of the Prophet's revelations. How did Muhammad go from being an ordinary person, a merchant of some sort, living his life in the city, to being the Prophet who changed the world? And here is the account of it. The commencement of the divine inspiration to the messenger of Allah was in the form of good dreams which came true like a bright daylight. And then the love of seclusion was bestowed on him. So it seemed, and I only know this account of it, that he had these dreams and intimations that there was a higher life and a better life and a life that is more enlightened than the life he was living in the city. And this led him not simply to go out and start to be a preacher, but the love of seclusion was bestowed on him. And he began to withdraw from the world for a time. The picture there, which I just downloaded from the web, obviously, is by tradition, the entrance to the cave that he would go to regularly. And it's a cave that is still identified today as a place where tourists, pilgrims visit. But the idea that the Prophet would go and hide out in that cave for days at a time, and then come back into the city and go back. As al-Bukhari continues, the Prophet used to go in seclusion to the cave of Hira, where he used to worship Allah alone continuously for many days before he would desire again to see his family, his wife, his children. He used to take with him for the journey food for the stay, and then come back to his wife, Khadija, to take food for another stay. So he became this person who was in the city, out of the city, in the city, out of the city. And I think that the gist of this is that he didn't really know what he was preparing for. He knew that he was changing his life, that he was taking a kind of ascetic path. But for all he knew, he would go out into the forest, he would go into the cave and would simply do this for the rest of his life. In the cave, out of the cave, into the cave, out of the cave. But he was actually being prepared by God for something new. So at the bottom of the page, you can see until suddenly the truth descended upon him while he was in the cave of Hira. The angel, I think it was Gabriel by tradition, came to him and asked him to recite. Recite what? He says, I don't know how to recite, but the recitation will become the Quran, which comes the words that come out of the prophet's mouth. But he says, like the prophet Jeremiah and others in the Bible, I don't know how to do this. I can't do this. I'm not ready to do this. But here the prophet reported, the angel caught me forcefully and pressed me so hard that I could not bear it anymore. It's apparently he's like being squeezed by the angel, physically squeezed by the angel, because he hasn't agreed to recite. The angel then released me and asked me again to recite, and I replied, but I do not know how to recite. So the angel caught me again and pressed me a second time until I could not bear it anymore. And then he released me and asked me to recite, but again I replied, I do not know how to recite. And so he caught me for the third time and pressed me, and then he released me and said to me, recite in the name of the Lord who created man from a clot of blood. Recite, like Lord is most noble, who taught by the pen, taught man that which he knew not. And by many traditions, these two verses that begin with recite are the first verses of the Quran that were revealed. And so the words that the angel speaks to the prophet, he then become words coming out of his mouth. And starting here, as you can see, Quran, Surah 96, starting there, he suddenly, the man who minded his own business, who prayed, who went to the cave, came back, and so on, suddenly the words started flooding out of his mouth without stopping. And again, this strikes me, and I brought this one in because it seemed to me that this was another way of imagining what was happening when one withdraws to a quiet place. So for the Buddha, it was kind of a path of knowledge, a path of inquiry, trying to understand the meaning of suffering. Here, it was suddenly encountering this word of God through the angel, which said, we will give you words for your mouth and you will speak them to the world around you. Up at the top here is that same stone I showed you above, the cave. And these are pilgrims who go to the cave to see where by tradition in Saudi Arabia today, where the prophet had these encounters. And I think this could be another reason, I think you can see the point, for us to withdraw in a sense and be silent in the season of Lent, because God may have something to say to us or through us. Second example. The third example, I was very concerned about having an example of a powerful woman who would also have a similar experience. And I ran into, and we can talk about this, the problem that in many traditional societies, East and West, it was easier for men to go out into the forest, men to become wanderers, and women had a much harder time. It was simply not possible for women to have that freedom. They were watched over by their husbands or by their fathers and so on like that. So I puttered around and came up with this Saint Andal. The T could be pronounced as the D, Andal. And she is a poet saint of the 9th century in South India, who has a hagiographical life built around her, that from a child, she loved the god Krishna. She wanted to be with the god Krishna. And by the end of the hagiographical accounts of her, she goes to the temple and dwells in the presence of Lord Krishna forever after, for the end of her life. But she's really known mainly for her poetry. And I'll give you two verses here from her most well-known work called Tirupavai, which means the holy vow. And this text is very interesting because in some ways my hypothesis is that this is a text that gives us something of what was available to women to set aside a holy month in the way that they couldn't follow the path of men and leave on their own and so on. Tirupavai has 30 verses, and it's recited in what's here at you can see below the picture, in the month of Magari, the winter month, the December, January month, in which young women would traditionally bathe in the river, the cold river in the winter in South India, not very cold, but they would bathe in the river, they would fast, they would do penances, in part praying for good marriage. So they kind of did ascetical practice in order to have a good, practical relationship, to find the right man for themselves and so on. What's different about Andal is that in her account, it ultimately is about union with God, a kind of a love story that takes place. And what's interesting too is that in each of the verses, it begins with one person speaking. And then in each verse, there is another woman and another woman and another woman until finally you have a crowd. So here in the picture, you can see that would be the god Vishnu, Narayana, with his two consorts. And then I think the figure on the left at the bottom would be Andal, her voice, inviting the other women to join her in this winter vow, going to the river, singing in the Lord's name. So it's very simple poetry, but I think it has a power to it about the winter vow and then receiving the vow. It is the month of Margary. The moon is full, the day auspicious. Come to bathe, you dear girls. Richly adorned and happy in the cowherd fields, land of abounding prosperity. Krishna, the son of Nanda Gopa, is fierce with his sharp spear. He is the youthful lion club of Yashoda, his mother, that woman with matchless eyes. Dark-hued and lotus-eyed is his face. He is both the sun and the moon. He is Narayana. He alone can give us the parai drum. Undertake this vow with me. The whole world will rejoice. Krishna, accept our vow. Nobody seems to really know what the parai drum is, but it seems to be part of the ritual where they would perhaps have the drum and perhaps beat the drum as part of their ritual. But the clear element of this is that the winter vow, one woman, then two, then three, then four, then five, taking a month, and still done today, is to somehow use this month of prayer, penance, and singing to find their way to God. I give you just one other verse as a sample. Here, the second verse gives you a glimpse of what kind of penance is in mind. They've mentioned bathing in the river. Here it comes up again. All you people of the world, consider the rituals of our Pavai vow, the sacred vow of this month. We sing the praises of the Supreme One, who rests silently on the ocean of milk. That's the Lord Krishna. We ourselves use no butter. We drink no milk. And daily we bathe before dawn. Kohl, eye, mascara does not darken our eyes. Flowers do not adorn our hair. We have not done nothing that is wrong. We have not spoken anything that is evil, but instead we give freely and offer alms to those in need. We live joyfully, trusting that all this will liberate us. Krishna, accept our vow. And I think what's interesting here is these small penances. So they're not starving themselves like the Buddha, and they're not bringing food out into the cave like Muhammad, but they're cutting back. They're living in cow country. And so no milk, no butter. Those are kind of withdrawing from the ordinary things of life. Bathing before dawn, again, when it's relatively cool. No adornments, no flowers, no makeup for this month in order to heighten and increase their love. And again, what's beautiful about it is that it's one woman, then two, then three, then four, then five. The picture above is a scene. It's too small to try to get into reading the Tamil print, but these are 19th century illustrations of the verses of this work, which can also be found if you look up Tirupavai on YouTube. You can hear it being sung and so on. But there, on the top part, there is the two women talking to one another. So they're talking as I think the woman who's standing up is inviting the other one to get up and come with her down to the river. And at the bottom, you have traditional ascetics, these male ascetics. And I think what's going on here is that the two kinds of asceticism are now being recognized as parallel. So the women at the top have their own kind of asceticism, their own practices that are allowed in the culture, whereas the men at the bottom are doing traditional ascetical practices as you would do in the desert and so on. And what struck me again with this is that there may be the path of wisdom, such as the Buddha followed, or this sense of coming out proclaiming a text as momentous and powerful as the Quran, the Prophet Muhammad. But here, this kind of world of women in the village, the cowherd women, the vow is basically to draw other women into the group, to bathe together, and ultimately in the 30th verse, they go to Krishna's house. And really what Andal has accomplished is composing 30 verses in beautiful Tamil, which are then passed down and sung by later generations of people. So these are the three examples that I've put forward as helping us to think about three people, two men, one woman, a Buddhist, a Muslim, and a Hindu, who have a sense of kind of doing something special for a period of time that then opens up the way to mission, to speaking and acting in the world. And I'll conclude just by several more notes. One is, I could go on forever, I suppose, not forever, literally, but for a longer time. And I was thinking of modern figures. If you ever saw the movie Gandhi, I recall that one of the most beautiful, intense scenes in the movie is the salt march to the sea. The people gather in larger and larger crowds, and they go to the sea to make salt from the salt water to protest against the restrictions the Raj is putting on them. Before that, there's a beautiful scene in the movie where Gandhi has gone back to his birthplace. And he's up there in Gujarat, and it looks like for a month he's not doing anything. And he's there, he's dwelling, he's thinking, he's reading. And at the end of it, in the scene that is quite famous, he's talking to the foreign journalist. And I think it's Martin Sheen, I think. He's talking to the journalist and then says, now is the time for action. And he gets up and he walks off, and he ends up walking all the way to the ocean. That he needed that time apart. Malcolm X, I was thinking about Malcolm X, as you know, Black Muslim, assassinated in the 1960s. He was part of the Nation of Islam, which was a group that was fairly stark on the gap between black and white, that we could have nothing in common, that white people were sent to torture black people, and that blacks had to separate themselves entirely. So Malcolm X, who had grown up Christian, goes off to Mecca on the Hajj, and he thinks he's one of the first American Muslims to do the Hajj to Mecca. And while he's there, he has this transformative experience. So he goes, he's doing the fasting, he dresses differently, he walks through the desert and so on. And he realizes that when you get to Mecca, you see that all people from every nation, different colors, different backgrounds, different ages, men and women, they're all equal in God's eyes. And he says that after the Hajj to Mecca, he could no longer be Nation of Islam. And he broke away and said, no longer will I allow race to divide me from other people. And he comes back and ends up soon being assassinated because the Nation of Islam sees him as a threat. But his pilgrimage changed the way he was in the world. Dorothy Day, in her beautiful book, The Long Loneliness, has that long sojourn on Staten Island, where I grew up, where she has a relationship with her boyfriend, Forster, and then has a baby, has the baby baptized, and then herself becomes a Catholic. And it almost seemed that before the great work of the Catholic worker began, she needed those year or two on Staten Island by the ocean in order to change. And finally, Nelson Mandela, who was arrested by the South African government. He spent decades on Robben's Island, this infamous place of penal punishment. And when he came out, he was a transformed figure and somehow had the wisdom and the graciousness and stature ultimately to free his nation from apartheid. And I think these are all figures who had this withdrawal in order to be able to step back into the world. Some Hindu, Dorothy Day, of course, a Christian in that case. So takeaways, and this is the end, this is my last slide here. Where does this leave us? And then we can talk about this. Lent is a season for repentance and renewal, but primarily a season for renewal for our work, our service in the world. In Lent, we symbolically withdraw from the world in order to return to it with more life, spirit, and love. Wisdom. In Lent, we can reimagine the world after being shocked and depressed by it, just like Gautama the Buddha. Speech. In Lent, we withdraw so as to be vulnerable to God's holy presence, to be ready if we are given a message for the world, like Muhammad the Prophet. In love, we fast, we do penance, we change our priorities so as to reach God the Beloved and to sing of and from that love, like Andal, the poet saint. And it would be very Buddhist and very Hindu, I think, to say there are different ways for different people. The way of wisdom, the way of prophecy, the way of love, the way of service. And all of these can be renewed if we learn to step back in the season of Lent. And the question really was my question at the beginning, what then is our mission as individuals and the community in 2022? How do we prepare for our mission in this Lenten season? So not just to save ourselves or improve ourselves, but to get back on mission as individuals and a parish. So I'll stop there, and squeezed a lot into a little bit longer than I want to go, but I'm not in any rush to go anywhere. So as long as anyone wants to talk about this, we can talk.